We'll now move on.
Unauthorised entry to football matches bill, second reading.
Mr. Brennan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Yes, it's me again, but I beg to move that the bill be now read a second time. Earlier on I was playing up front, but I'm back here at the back now for this part, and I hope to be back on the front bench later on today if my bill makes the progress that I hope it will do after our second reading debate. Now, on Sunday the 11th of July 2021, the final of the men's Euros football tournament at Wembley could have resulted in not just the sad loss for the English football team in the final, but in a tragic loss of life. That was the finding of the independent review that was conducted by Baroness Louise Casey into the events of that day, suggesting that we narrowly escaped a disaster that could have resulted in fatalities or irreversible injuries. And of course, for everyone here, the mere thought that such a catastrophe is still possible in this country at a football match in the 21st century, after the tragedies of the latter part of the last century, is a profoundly unsettling thought. I know that there were some members of this House who were present at the Euro 2020 final. It took place in 2021, but it was still the Euro 2020 final, and witnessed firsthand the reckless behaviour of some people seeking to enter the stadium without a ticket for the final. But I do have to admit, I was genuinely shocked to discover when the House of Commons Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee, of which I was a member at the time, undertook an inquiry following the Euros that entering or attempting to enter a football match without a ticket was not a specific criminal offence. And that's why the need for my bill was supported by that committee in a recommendation contained within its report on safety at major sporting events, which was published in December of last year. And I think, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that demonstrates the broad level of cross-party support there is in recognition of this problem and the consensus on the need for legislative action to put it right. And indeed, all of the members of that select committee, if honourable members want to take a glance at the bill, all of the members of that select committee at the time, with seats within the territorial scope of my bill, which incidentally is Wales and England, are the named co-sponsors on the face of the bill. So this has the full support of the select committee. Now, my measure brings into law recommendations that came out of the select committee's findings, but also of the Baroness Casey review, amending the Football Offences Act 1991 by introducing a new offence for unauthorised or attempted unauthorised entry to football matches. It's actually estimated that at the Euro 2020 final, somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 people, ticketless individuals, were able to gain entry. And many people will have seen the disorder that was caused, the overcrowding, and the safety hazards that resulted from those events. And these are actions that not only compromise the safety and security of stewards, police officers, of spectators, of players and officials, but they also greatly tarnish the reputation of the sport and of this country. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
Giving way. I mean, the thing that really surprised me is this wasn't just your average stadium. This is a stadium, purpose-built with which you would expect would have the best security, and yet those numbers of people were still able to get through and cause potential, as the honourable member said, potential loss of life.
Well, I think my honourable friend's absolutely right. I think we were all shocked to think that this was a relatively new flagship national stadium and that these events were able to take place there. And it does actually, call into question some thinking about the way that these stadiums are designed. And Wembley obviously has a particular feature of a long Wembley Way, which goes back to when the stadium was originally opened, I think in 1923 probably originally, and traditionally lots of fans approach in that direction in very large numbers. One thing that my bill does, though, that might assist the concerns of my honourable friend, is that it makes it possible for the offence to be enforced not just at the turnstile, but around the premises on private land, so that an outer security cordon can also effectively enforce the offence that is being created by my bill. So that should certainly help in a place like Wembley, whereas my honourable friend says, it was quite shocking to see the numbers of people that were able to get past stewards and then to rush entry into the ground. I'll give way to the honourable member.
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way, and I support his bill. I think he's right to bring this forward. But in the spirit of scrutinising legislation, just on that particular point that he made, he's using what happened at the Euros as a justifiable reason for his bill, and I go along with that. But by increasing the scope of it to include different areas, which in the explanatory notes it seems include bars and car parks, it seems to me that he's making the same offence if somebody tries to blag their way into a car park as if they're trying to tailgate their way into the Euro semi-final. Does he really think that those two should be treated in the same way?
Well, I welcome the intervention from the honourable gentleman, who's also always very assiduous in his scrutiny of legislation, and quite rightly so. In isolation, no, it doesn't create this offence for somebody who's trying to get into a car park. It just reflects the reality of the areas around football grounds. If you take the Cardiff City Stadium, which is located, as I'll refer to later on, in my own constituency, it was built a few years ago, replacing the old Ninian Park Stadium across the road. And like a lot of newer stadiums, it's in a slightly more out-of-town location, surrounded by car parks that are there specifically to serve people who want to attend the match. Now, in some instances, in order to be effectively be able to enforce the intention of the creation of this new offence, it might be necessary to set up an outer cordon that is immediately outside the premises of the stadium itself. And that's the purpose of that provision within the bill. It's certainly, and indeed within those areas, there may be other hospitality settings within those sorts of areas close to the stadium, but outside the turnstiles themselves. And in that instance, if another security cordon needed to be set up, it would mean my bill could be enforced in that instance, thus preventing people who came not with the intention and with a ticket of attending the match, but simply coming along in order to try and, to use the slang term, jib their way in to the ground. They could be prevented from doing so. But I do welcome the intervention from the honourable gentleman. Now, the current legal framework, actually I should go on to say, not only compromises the safety of the individuals I mentioned and tarnishes the reputation of the country potentially, but the Euros are returning here in 2028, and we can't afford there to be a replay of these events. The current legal framework doesn't really address the problem. Those caught having entered without authorisation face no legal repercussions, and those attempting to enter are simply moved on, and they often try on multiple times to try and gain entry. There's no consequences for those selfish actions, and they risk jeopardising the matches, and they could recklessly endanger the safety of lives and lives of others. So this bill is intended as a direct response to these challenges. By making unauthorised entry to football matches a specific offence, the aim is to deter individuals from attempting to enter stadiums without a valid ticket. And just before this morning's debate, Mr Deputy Speaker, I did an interview with, amongst others, Martin Keown, the former Arsenal footballer, on Talk Sport. And I think that was a feeling in that discussion that the deterrence effect of this measure is a significant part of it. Because if you are subject to a fine of up to £1,000, that might be a deterrent. But an even greater deterrent, in my view, that's part of this bill, is that conviction of this offence could lead to a court-imposed football banning order under the Football Spectators Act 1989 and Football open brackets offences close brackets Act 1991, preventing individuals from attending football matches for a specified period between 3 and 10 years. And this bill seeks to address all forms of unauthorised entry, recognising the broad spectrum of tactics employed to gain access to stadiums illicitly. I'll give way again to the honourable gentleman.
Of course, it begs the question as to why this only is designed to apply to football, because it seems to me that the same thing could apply to the Rugby World Cup final at Twickenham or any other big sport, the Olympics when we had that, and may have it again in the future. Is the honourable gentleman saying that this is a problem unique to football, or is there any other reason why this bill and the provisions in the bill shouldn't apply to any major sporting events which may in the future have the same problem?
Of course, that's an extremely valid point that the honourable gentleman raises, and I've spoken with the Football Supporters Association in relation to this bill, and they generally have a concern about any legislation that singles out football, if you like, in this way. The reality is that in the legislative framework we have in this country, there is already in existence quite a significant suite of legislation that applies particularly to football, that was born out of some of the events I referred to earlier on, of the incidents that took place in the latter part of the last century. We've moved on hugely from that. I think we all thought we'd moved permanently on from the sorts of scenes, though, that were witnessed at the Euros final. But I absolutely accept the fact that there is a case to be made, because there have been problems in other types of events in recent years, for a wider look at this whole issue of gaining illicit entry into venues, whether it's for a music concert, a festival, whether it's for another type of sporting event. And I think that's something that the government and the opposition, Her Majesty's opposition, if it is indeed to become the next government shortly, that they should actually look further into the best way in order to achieve that outcome. In the relatively narrow confines of my private member's bill, with the opportunity to be able to amend legislation that's already on the statute book, and with the imminence of some very significant future events in football coming along, I think it's justified in this instance to bring forward a measure that particularly applies to football. But the broader point that the honourable gentleman makes is absolutely valid. Now, the scope of this bill extends across the top tiers of domestic football. So we're not talking about the local park match, Mr Deputy Speaker. So that would include, in England and Wales, the top tiers. That's the Premier League, the Championship, Leagues 1 and 2, the National League, the Women's Super League and Championship, and the Cymru Premier competition, as well as international matches in England and Wales. I will give way to my honourable friend.
My honourable friend, forgive me, he's making an excellent speech, and I'm so glad he's able to clarify that the top tiers will be included, because although we hear about the super leagues and all the rest of it, places like my own Newport County, my beloved Newport County, are very important too, and although they may not be the very, very top tier, they're obviously as good as that, but they're in a slightly lower tier. But it's just important that we have clarification that they will be included too, because it's important to them.
Well, she's absolutely right. Somebody chuckled when she said they're as good as the top tier. I think the fright they gave to Manchester United recently in their FA Cup tie absolutely confirms the veracity of my honourable friend's judgment about Newport County. And I do remember, as a young man who grew up only 5 miles up the road from the old Somerton Park — they play in a different ground now — often sneaking away without telling my mother on the 123 bus to go and watch Newport County play, always at 3:15, Mr Deputy Speaker, on a Saturday afternoon, because of the proximity to the Llanwern steelworks, to allow the steelworkers finishing their shift to be able to attend the match, which is why on what's now called when the results were led out, you may remember, those of us who are old enough, that Newport County's home games were always late kick-off rather than being announced at 4:45 in the usual way. So, yes, she's absolutely right, and it would apply to Newport County, and it would apply to right down as far as the National League in the men's game in England and the other leagues I mentioned. And in fact, the Cardiff City Stadium, which I've already said is in my constituency, hosts the home games not just of Cardiff City, but of the Welsh national teams. And it would be remiss of me during the course of my speech not to mention the impeccable behaviour of Welsh fans attending matches there, and the cracking atmosphere that they create with passionate renditions of songs like Henrad van Hadau and Yma o Hyd. The vast majority of football fans across the country, supporting clubs like my team, Cardiff City, or any other teams, do so in the right spirit. And it's important they can feel safe and secure, though, in supporting their football team. So I want to make it clear the intention of this bill is to support real football fans and to keep them safe and secure whilst they're enjoying the spectacle of supporting their team. Now, football is a big part of our national culture. Mr. Deputy Speaker, as honourable members know, I represent a Welsh constituency. I was born and brought up in Wales, and we're often associated with rugby, and I hope after today's debate to hop over to Dublin for the Wales-Ireland rugby match in the Six Nations on the weekend. But in fact, in recent years, football has grown ever more important in the national culture of Wales, and it's always been of huge importance across the rest of the UK, and bringing together individuals from all walks of life in shared support of their teams. So the actions of a few shouldn't be allowed to compromise the safety and security of the measure. Now, in drafting this bill, and I thank government civil servants for their help in doing so, I've been mindful of the balance between enhancing security and maintaining the open and inclusive nature of football matches. It's not the intention to criminalise fans or to create barriers to genuine supporters enjoying the game. Instead, the focus is on preventing those who would seek to cause disorder and harm from entering stadiums and thus ensuring a safer environment for all. And by strengthening the legal framework, we can deter unauthorised entry, we can reduce that risk of disorder and violence, and we can ensure that football continues to be a source of joy and community for everyone. So I urge the House to allow my second bill its second reading today. But before I go on to finish, I'm going to give way to the honourable gentleman who's just successfully got his bill through a second reading, and I'm sure we'll want to reciprocate on this one.
I'm highly supportive of this bill, and I congratulate him on bringing it to the House. Back in 2011, I had another successful private member's bill, the Sports Ground Safety Authority Bill. And I think the honourable member's bill runs in that fine tradition of improving safety at our sports ground and for sports fans themselves and people around. If I heard the territorial extent of the bill, I think it didn't include some of our devolved authorities in Scotland, perhaps, and Northern Ireland as well. If he is successful, as I hope he is with this bill, will he and perhaps the Minister as well share their learnings on this with the Northern... we're all delighted that we have a Northern Ireland devolved assembly now. Will they share that with their colleagues in Scotland and in Northern Ireland? Because if they are going to host, particularly if they're going to host Euros or World Cups in the future, they would want this sort of excellent measure in place, like England and Wales will have.
Yes, and I congratulate him on getting his bill through its second reading, and for the second time, that's quite an achievement, and hopefully he'll get it through all the rest of the stages before the general election. And I don't normally necessarily approve of Lords, but on this occasion he's an elected Lord, and therefore I do approve of the fact he's got his bill through. And he's absolutely right that this bill applies territorially to England and Wales, because that's the scope of the current legislation that I'm seeking to amend through this particular bill. And Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland have their own laws in relation to safety at football matches and so on, and I certainly would encourage them to take a look at my measure. I'm a big believer in devolution, so I wouldn't tell them what to do, but I think it would be they might find some useful ideas from taking a look at this measure, and he's right to point that out to the House. So I think it's possible that we can come together today, Mr. Deputy Speaker, from all sides of the House and send a strong message that such behaviour won't be tolerated, and that the safety and security of people attending and working at football matches are of absolute importance. And my bill reflects our collective responsibility to address the challenges facing the sport and to ensure that football remains a positive and uniting force in our society. And I do thank the English Football Association, the Football Association of Wales, for their support in drafting this bill, and to the members of the DCMS Select Committee, and as I said, the civil servants and officials, clerks, and so on, for the support for the bill, and also to Mary in the members' tea room, who I discussed my bill with this morning, and has given it her full support, showing that it passes the common sense test, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I commend it to the House.
Is that the bill be now read a second time? Philip Davies.
It's a pleasure to follow the honourable member for Cardiff West, and I'm delighted before the end of his speech he managed to get the common sense in there, because Mr. Deputy Speaker, my wife wouldn't have forgiven me if I hadn't mentioned the words common sense in my speech, and he gave me a perfect opportunity to do so. So I thank him for that. And I rise to support his bill. I think the bill that he brings forward is something that is important and it is worthwhile. And I do wish it safe passage through both Houses of Parliament. But, Mr. Deputy Speaker, as you know, I take my role on a Friday very seriously, and it's the danger with private members' bills is that they start with a worthy sentiment upon which we all agree, and they end up going through both Houses of Parliament with very little scrutiny, because everybody agrees with the worthy sentiment, and we end up potentially with bad legislation that nobody intended, with unintended consequences, because it probably wasn't scrutinised enough. And so I just want to test out, I raised a couple of points with the honourable gentleman earlier, and I just want to test out them a bit further here, and maybe another point or two as well. And it'd be interesting to get the Minister's view on that when he comes to wind up, and of course the honourable gentleman himself when he winds up the debate at the end, to see whether or not, it may well be that the answer is not, but whether or not any amendments may be considered at the committee stage or the report stage that could either improve the bill or take something out that maybe wasn't intended. But I don't intend to speak for long, which will be a huge relief to everybody, particularly on a Friday, and I do so genuinely in a spirit of trying to be constructive to raise issues. And like I say, as long as they're considered, I think that's the important bit, even if they're then dismissed. And I do want to just start with the reason why the bill is important, and the honourable gentleman set it out very well in his opening remarks, is about what happened at the Euro final, where it was estimated that 3,000 to 5,000 people without tickets gained entry to the final. Didn't just actually try, they actually did gain entry to the final through mass forced entry at turnstiles, and I don't think it was even necessarily just by tailgating. It was through a deliberate ploy of forcing the way into the stadium. And of course he's absolutely right about the problems that causes. It's unfair, because if they end up sitting in seats that other people have legitimately paid for and can't get to their seat, that's bad enough. But there is also a massive issue of safety and security, and we've seen tragically in the past what can happen at football stadiums when things are not as they should be. And so on that basis, he's absolutely right to bring this forward, and I wouldn't want to gainsay any of that at all. My concerns, although I accept, Mr. Deputy Speaker, are minor, are still genuine, and I wouldn't want to see rules which are designed to tackle very bad behaviour being applied excessively to people who I don't think it necessarily the bill really is looking for. And I mentioned about car parks and blagging your way into a car park, and I am slightly concerned that the way that the bill is written. I mean, the honourable gentleman opposite, I mean, I don't know what you think, Mr. Deputy Speaker, but I've always considered him to be a bit of a cheeky chappy, and he looks to me like the type of person who might one day, not today as a very serious politician, but he just has the look of a person who in the past, before his political career, may well have tried to blag his way in somewhere. He just has that look about him that he may well have tried to... I'll give way to him.
The honourable gentleman is a very astute individual. In 1978, when I was very young indeed, the first time I ever attended Twickenham to go to watch Gareth Edwards win his 50th cap for Wales at rugby, me and three of my friends got into the ground by virtue of a £5 note for which we were given £2 change, even though we didn't have tickets. I was very young, and I'm not, but I think I should confess that as he's raised the issue.
Well, we're all very grateful. It's amazing what you find out in these on a Friday, isn't it, Mr. Deputy Speaker? It's like a confessional. Maybe other people want me to give way, and they can declare their interest as well. We've probably now found out why this only applies to football and not any other sport, Mr. Deputy Speaker, as well, accidentally. But my point is that I think there's a world of difference. There is a world of difference between a group of people who have a deliberate strategy of public disorder to force their way into, through sheer weight of numbers, into an event, causing all sorts of serious, potentially serious repercussions, and somebody who is desperate to get to an event, who hasn't got a ticket, who cheekily tries to blag their way in through one means or another. My concern is, I think most people would accept that there is a world of difference between the two. And what I wouldn't want to see, potentially, is that the same weight of the law clamp down on the first group in the same way as it would the second group. My slight fear is that the way the bill is written at the moment, potentially that could happen. Somebody who cheekily, a young person who tried to cheekily blag their way into an event, could find themselves facing the same repercussions as somebody else. And I don't think anybody would want that to happen. I'm not sure whether or not there is a way legally of differentiating between those two things. It may well be that we look at it and say, well, actually, that's for a court to make that adjudication. But I wouldn't want, in effect, somebody who tried to cheekily blag their way into an event find themselves being treated as severe a criminal as somebody who's making a forced entry with public disorder designs. It would be nice if we could at least think about how we do that. And of course, the second part of that is that in the explanatory notes, it makes clear that the penalty for this is a fine not exceeding £1,000. And of course, you could argue, Mr. Deputy Speaker, with justification that therefore the fine can be varied based on the situation. If a minor offence was taking place, that would be reflected in the fine. But of course, it does go on to say that a court must, not may, the court must also issue a football banning order following conviction for the offence. Now, it does say unless it considers there are particular circumstances that would make it unjust. I accept that. But it is actually, in effect, saying that really, ordinarily, whatever the scale of the offence, that is what the court should do. It doesn't even say it should do, it says it must do. I'll give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
This point might be useful. He's absolutely right, and that's the way that the legislation, currently operates. But there is discretion available to the court if someone is brought forward in front of them not to issue a banning order in exactly the sorts of circumstances he described. Where it wasn't somebody intent on causing serious disorder, and where it was perhaps what might be referred to colloquially as a cheeky bit of attempted jibbing. But nevertheless, I would envisage that in those circumstances, at first someone might get turned away. But if they were persistent, what this bill means is that if they persisted in it, then they could be subject to this offence.
I'm very grateful for that clarification, Mr. Deputy Speaker, which I think it was genuinely useful. The other point I do want to just spend a very few minutes on is the point I intervened on the Honourable Gentleman earlier, which is about other events. Because it seems to me that if this is an issue, then it is an issue, and it shouldn't just apply to football matches. And I would be very interested to hear what the Minister and the Shadow Minister have to say about this in particular, because this country is renowned for hosting world-leading sporting events across the piece. Rugby World Cup, Rugby League World Cup, the Olympics, the athletics, whatever it may be. Most of those events have tickets which are very much sought after, oversubscribed. We are a sport-loving nation. And it seems to me that this bill has come largely as a result of what happened at the Euros, as the Honourable Gentleman said himself. And often in this place, Mr Deputy Speaker, we pass legislation as a result of something happening. Something goes wrong and we think something must be done about it, and therefore we pass a piece of legislation reactively in order to deal with an issue that has already happened. Now, as this hasn't yet happened to the best of my knowledge, it may well have happened, but I'm not aware of it, and other people with more expertise will know. But as it didn't happen at maybe the Rugby World Cup final or the Rugby League World Cup final or whatever, nobody's therefore brought forward any legislation about it because it hasn't happened. Now, it might seem unusual, and I am unusual before you get in there first, Mr Deputy Speaker, but I think rather than just always passing legislation reactively, perhaps we might have a crack sometimes at passing legislation proactively and trying to anticipate things that may happen and trying to nip them in the bud beforehand. And it seems to me that the Honourable Gentleman's brought forward a bill, the basis of a bill which we could actually use to do something a bit more proactively. And so is there any reason why the provisions in this bill could not apply to a range of other major events, particularly major sporting events, so that we don't have to wait for them to happen before we do something about it? We can actually get in there first and try and stop them from happening in the first place, or at least make sure we've got appropriate penalties for people who do it. And of course the Honourable Gentleman opposite for Cardiff West, he's renowned for his huge support for the music industry, and I commend him for everything that he does for the music industry. He's one of their greatest champions in the House. I suspect, I could be wrong, but I suspect this is I'm not an expert in the way that the Honourable Gentleman is. I may be enthusiastic, but I don't have the same expertise. But if I was as a layman were to guess, I would have thought that this type of issue was more of an issue at music events than it is for sporting events. Now, I could be completely wrong about that, but I suspect it probably is. Now, it may well be, Mr Deputy Speaker, and like I say, I'll certainly bow to the Honourable Gentleman's opposite's greater expertise. It may well be that there is legislation in place that helps deal with these things at music events. I don't know. I admit my ignorance in that regard. But if not, it seems to me that this kind of legislation must be just as important for big music events, concerts, etc., which are often held, by the way, at the same sporting locations and stadiums as sporting events. We're talking about often the same locations, like places like Wembley, for example, and all the rest of it. Why is it that we're just restricting ourselves to football? I genuinely don't understand why this is seen as just a football issue. Like I say, I know that it's come as a reaction to what happened at the Euros, and therefore that's why I suspect it is. But surely in this place, we must be able to use our wit to say, well, this has been a problem here, but anticipate that this could well be a problem at similar events, whether sporting or music concerts, etc. And so, could I just ask, in drawing my remarks to a close, Mr Deputy Speaker, could I just ask whoever, the Honourable Gentleman, the Minister, who I know will continue to take a great interest in all of these issues anyway, but also the Minister and the Shadow Minister, if they would give this some thought and maybe address this particular issue, that if we're so adamant that this legislation is necessary in this regard, which I think it is, and as I say, I support this legislation with my couple of reservations that I mentioned earlier, surely I would just urge everybody who have got far more influence than me to think about whether or not we could introduce similar legislation, if necessary, for other big sporting events and maybe music events too.
Mr Speaker, so I rise to thank you so much for bringing the bill forward. The Honourable Member for Cardiff has done a great job in setting out the reasons for this, and I'm happy to say I support his bill. I just wanted to highlight, in a similar vein to my colleague from Shipley, a couple of questions, but let's explain again why it's important. People aggressively trying to enter events unticketed are not just putting the fellow attendees at risk, but potentially they're putting the stewards at risk, especially in, as we saw in the Euros, extra security was drafted in. That's often people who have only had a basic level of training from their company, and faced with tens, if not hundreds of people, those individuals that are trying to do the right thing and protect the establishment were put at risk during those events, as well as people potentially at risk of overcrowding and squash. And let's never forget the tragedy that was Hillsborough, although unconnected to non-ticketed fans, as we now know, large groups of people in small spaces is a frightening prospect and can lead to a tragic loss of life. But I want to make sure that people understand it's about the people that are seeking to uphold the rules, as well as the people who have bought and paid for tickets, that we need to look out for. There's also, though, a couple of exceptions that I would be really interested if the bill could explore in committee. So, as referenced from the Honourable Lady from Newport and the front bench opposite, neither of you, I think, subscribe to the Manchester United fan club as I do. I suspect that the opposite front bench, perhaps he's even a Manchester City fan, which probably explains his positive reaction to the totally under control Newport game that we had earlier in the season. And in many respects, actually, being it's arguable that being a United fan in recent years has been a triumph of loyalty over necessarily pleasure or enjoyment. But, and as an aside, if I share with the House, actually, not so very long ago, my father and I took my nephew to Old Trafford to watch United, and we discovered that he is the 5th generation of Fletcher to watch United at Old Trafford. So you can accuse me of being very many things, but a Glory supporter is not one of them. But on an occasion, especially as, currently only in the Premier League, but it's likely to roll down the leagues, United were experimenting with changing tickets from paper tickets or plastic card tickets to QR code tickets. And quite famously, if you look back at the press reports at the time, there was actually a problem with that ticketing system. And I am going to confess to the House, in the spirit of other admissions made from the member opposite, I was in a possession of a valid ticket for that game, but the failure of the system led to a huge backlog of fans locked out, and that there was a big press of people, and I, amongst hundreds of others, hopped the turnstiles in possession of a valid ticket, partly in fear of just the genuine crush behind, because the people behind couldn't hear what was going on. They didn't understand why the normal flow of people through the turnstiles wasn't occurring. So perhaps the Minister could respond, but I would like to seek assurances that we are going to not criminalise people such as myself, who were in possession of a valid ticket and perhaps might have made the most legitimate entry to the ground, but through genuine reasons of fear for personal safety and a desire to watch United lose again, obviously motivated in other areas. So I'd be grateful if the Minister could respond on that, and whether we can make sure that that consideration has been taken should this bill, as I hope it does, reach committee stage after today's second reading debate. And then, but finally, I think there's something else I want to talk to. So being a member of the Stretford End, you hear chats and noises elsewhere where people have been accidentally caught up in football banning orders. Now, let me just state on the record, it's absolutely abhorrent when people go to football games to cause trouble, to have fights, to put people under threats. And the transformation during my lifetime, where football was a thing that young children couldn't be taken to because it wasn't safe for them, that's no longer the case. It's a family-friendly activity that people can enjoy. It's got some edge to it. I'd never want to see that go. It's almost the acceptable face of the Iron Age tribal system writ large these days in football. which I think it was Saatchi that said it's the most important of the not important things. But there have been instances where people who were bystanders to trouble have been given sanctions either by club or the football banning orders. And if we are seeking to extend this from violence to people trying to get into grounds without ticketing, which I agree is important, not least for previously mentioned, are we confident that the people that both evaluate and issue those football banning orders are held to the levels of evidence and standards of evidence that we would expect to see as part of a law? Who is it that actually has the final say? What's the mechanism of appeal? So what's not clear to me, and perhaps we can seek clarity in this debate, is I understand the point the honourable gentleman from Cardiff North was making about including car parks, especially in out-of-town stadiums. But what threshold of evidence, if somebody's one that, you know, hopped into the car park to get an autograph from a fan, is that the same as somebody aggressively trying to knock a turnstile down? And how do we make sure that we find the right level of interest? Yeah, I'm very happy to give way to them.
I'm very grateful. She's making a very serious point and a very good point. But just on a more humorous level, Madam Deputy Speaker, could it not be argued that the way that Manchester United have been playing the last few years, that a banning order would be a reward rather than a punishment?
When he next comes over to watch Manchester United at Old Trafford, let's just make sure we check his passport as he comes over the top. Manchester United is one of the greatest and most important clubs, and it's important to remember, you know, the Busby Babes and this year's important anniversary of the Munich air disaster. However, I concede that future peaks are to be scaled by the magnificence of our team, and I will support them all the way in doing so. And an honourable mention for Sir Jim Ratcliffe, who this week got final confirmation of his purchase and support of the club. On a serious note, though, how are Leeds doing these days? Oh, never mind. Right, okay.
Best left there.
Yeah, okay. So I've always enjoyed the colour of the kit. I think mustard is such an aggressive colour to go to battle in. But semi-seriously, you make a very good point, which is that football is about fun and banter, and it's about local pride, and people seeking to aggressively get into grounds without tickets puts all of that enjoyment at risk. And I do support this legislation. But perhaps we could just get some clarity to make sure that the enthusiastic jet kid, as my honourable friend mentioned, or perhaps the slightly over-enthusiastic tourist is not caught up in this, and that crucially, if somebody is subject to this law and wants to seek to appeal, can we make sure that they have the right levels of justice? Because whilst going to Manchester United at the moment may be not the most edifying experience, I think being banned for life by accident is probably a travesty we would seek to make sure doesn't happen. Thank you very much.
Shadow Minister Alex Norris.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to speak for the opposition in this debate. I can congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Cardiff West, and I will be giving him my support today, that's for sure. He's a very skilled parliamentarian, but he's demonstrated the best skill, as indeed the honourable member for Woking did when he was in his place, is to get drawn out the private member's ballot. That really is a good one. But, you know, it's still a skill in itself to choose something that then has a degree of chance of succeeding, and again, keeping it narrow, short and cheap is generally a good way, and he's passed those tests here also today. Madam Deputy Speaker, Britain does sporting events really well. We've got great infrastructure, stadia, volunteers flock to be their part of it. Who can forget that with the Olympic Games? So whether it is events like the Olympics, whether it's Champions League finals, whether it's the games that are on every weekend, we do them very well. We also do football better than any other place on the planet. And of course, that's a huge part of Brand Britain, the global TV product. But I think the beauty really is that every weekend, and this weekend will be no exception, for the Premier League alone, 500,000 people will make those journeys short and long, and in some cases very, very long, across the country to see their team and to share allegiance, to perhaps swear at other fans, to sing songs with incredible creativity. I think there's a real beauty in that. There's something very British and something very special. But those two things together, that success with major events, that love of football and football done well, made what we saw at the final of Euro 2021 even more shocking. That's not what we want to see. 3,000 to 5,000 people, as my honourable friend says, jibbing in. It is dangerous, and it is very lucky, as we saw from the independent report, that there wasn't greater harm caused. So I think what the honourable gentleman proposes is a good and a very smart way of addressing this. But I just want to cover some of the points he made and some of the points that other colleagues made as well at this juncture. I think the point that the honourable member for Cardiff West made around the deterrent effect, and he made on the radio earlier, I think that's exactly right. I think that's likely to be the case. I don't think it could be overstated, actually. The maximum £1,000 fine, that's a lot of money by anybody's standards. But the banning order particularly is something that will get people's attention, because that is a really serious sanction. Supporting your club becomes a very big part of your identity. If you are a match-going fan who goes home and away, it's a huge part of your life, your lifestyle, your friendship groups. That is something I know that gets people's attention. So I think that is a good sanction in this case. Just to address a couple of points from the honourable member for Shipley, who I share a lot of views on when it comes to sport. He knows what he's talking about, and I know he's a match-going fan himself and talks a lot of sense on sport. His point on scrutiny on Fridays is very important. We owe it to our constituents to do this as well as we can, whatever day of the week it is, because this will, presumably the intention of this is for it to be the law of the land. And we always have to have that test in mind, that good cases make bad laws. And I always think about that, particularly on Fridays. But I think that the honourable gentleman has passed the test here. Because the point about unintended consequences that he made, I think Section 3 should give quite a lot of comfort for that. I think the explanatory notes are very fulsome on what the bill is intended not to do. So that certainly gave me comfort there, particularly with relation to Section 3, brackets B, brackets little I, around things like a 17-year-old using an under 16-year-old's ticket. That is a breach of terms and conditions, and you probably shouldn't do that, but in itself should not criminalise that individual, and the club can manage that, I believe, with a sanction which is likely to be probably an internal ban, a short one. That is, of course, the right level. I think the balance has been found in this case. I might disagree, though, with him on the cheekiness point, because my fear there is, these are big stadiums. The honourable member for South Ribble said these are big concentrations of human beings in one place. 90,000 capacity at Wembley. And, and he and I may agree a lot on sport, but I suspect we disagree quite a lot on health and safety legislation and its effectiveness and necessity. In this space, it's exceptionally important, and even one person more than the capacity is a dangerous thing in itself. So whilst I agree with the sentiment of him, if someone just trying their luck shouldn't become, have a criminal record and really significant sanction, that is probably right. In general, I don't think we should encourage it. I think people should need to know that it's a dangerous thing to do and they shouldn't do it. On his point on breadth, again, it's my view that this is good for and right for football, and I think it follows from there that in those other examples that he mentions, it would be good and right too. I understand, and I think I do agree with the approach the honourable gentleman has taken, because keeping it narrow and basing it on legislation already on the statute book is the best way for it to succeed. I think going broader may have imperilled that as a venture, but I do think that's incumbent on both the government and ourselves as the opposition to look at now what approach could be taken to broaden it. And, of course, to follow the evidence and to consult relevant organisations. But I just think the basic principle that people entering something that they're not supposed to, they're not ticketed to enter, which makes a really, really dangerous health and safety breach, well, that is a bad thing, whether that's at the football or anywhere else. And I think, you know, as the Honourable Gentleman did, we should point out that with, you know, football fans often get a tough ride. They shouldn't be unduly singled out. And I think it's important that I think everyone said that, but that we should say that. And then just on the contributions to the Honourable Member for South Ribble, and again, it shows, I think, the kind of cultural hegemony of football and the importance that it is to British life. First conversation I had with the Honourable Lady somewhere around that doorway was about, you know, we'd just had our election. I will give way, happily.
A very pleasant way to be welcomed into the behind-the-scenes bipartisanship that is not always visible to the public, and I think it's important to get that on the record, even if it was totally the wrong football team it was supporting.
And I absolutely agree with that, and you know, I think perhaps my friendship with the Honourable Member for Staffordshire Moorlands comes because she goes to City like I go to City, and that's something we talk about. Also, the Honourable Member for Crewe and Nantwich. In fact, I can tell you with absolute certainty every City fan in Parliament, and I reckon I could do pretty well everybody's teams, not the Honourable Gentleman for Tonbridge and Mallingham. I'm looking forward to this. I've always had
I'm absolutely shocked that he is not an avid follower of the Tonbridge Angels.
There we go. I am going to resist the temptation to ask him who the left back is, because I think that could expose him. I give way happily.
Honourable Gentleman will understand that I dare risk the wrath of my colleague on the Science and Technology Committee, Sir Graham Stringer, if I don't mention he's a United fan.
I can name those miscreants on our own benches very well. The Honourable Member for Ellesmere, Port and Neston is the first one that springs to mind here. But it is a good, of course, so, you know, that it is a part of our cultural life. It's part of those sort of bonds that bring us together. And, you know, I think, you know, that's why it's important it's safeguarded and done properly and safely. The point she made about security stuff, I think about this quite a lot. And I'm going to talk when I finish about some recent experiences at football that really concerned me. But we're often asking staff who generally aren't permanent employees of the club, they're probably third-party contractors, they're not necessarily particularly well paid, and they are in dangerous circumstances. I worry less, frankly, about the ones near the pitch as to those who have to steward near the toilets, and again I'll talk about that shortly. And then she made some very important points about what this is and isn't designed to deter, and she used her own example, and I think we can have comfort on that, because 1A from in the new Act, subsection 2, she would have had a defence under that because she had a ticket. Now, it's not, as she said, a desirable way for entry to happen, but she wouldn't have committed an offence under this legislation. So, I think that speaks to kind of the effectiveness by which it's been drafting. Just to make a few final points in closing, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is important we don't demonise football fans. I say this, I am a match-going fan. I was for a bit, I think we all were legacy fans. I didn't really take to that very kindly. But it is a huge part, you know, my love of Manchester City is a huge part of my life. It's a huge part of my personality, a much bigger one, my wife might say, than it really ought to be. But whether it's third tier to the Champions League final, I've kind of been there and seen it all. And I literally would be incapable every so often on my social media feed. I apologise to the Honourable Lady in advance, but the Ilkay Gundogan goal, last year's FA Cup final will pop up. I can't go past it. I watch it at least half a dozen times because it was just such a great moment. And football fans are having a tougher time. You know, messed around. You know, the kick-off times, I think, you know, being asked to do some very long journeys. City fans will be at Bournemouth on Saturday and have to get back to Manchester for a game that will end at nearly 8 o'clock at night. That's very difficult. You know, and there is still some stigmatisation, which I don't think is good. And, you know, some of these challenges are present in other sports too. So it's important that fans aren't singled out. And I think that we found that balance right. But there is an issue coming down the line that either this government or a future government will have to address around some of the things that are happening at football. Because actually what happened at that final was not something in isolation. Some of the things that we are seeing, and you know, social media can skew your perception of these things, but some of the videos that we see, behaviours are changing. You know, I've, as I said, witnessed some things in toilets, both away at Brentford, home to Chelsea, this year alone, that really shocked me. Illegal acts generally centred around drugs, and you're left with poor stewards trying to deal with how to to address that. You know, there are things around behaviour at football that shouldn't be condoned. You know, we know that people are going to go, they're going to have fun, they're going to shout, they're going to swear, going to drink, all that's fine. But there are things that still, you know, the laws of the land must apply, whether it's in a football, whether it's in, you know, in public or in the toilet of a football stadium. And, you know, I think it's going to behove us to look at some of that. But we'll have to, you know, it's got to be evidence-based, it's got to be working with the Supporters Association who do such good work to make sure that those are proportionate interventions. But what we have today in front of us is absolutely a proportionate intervention, and I look forward to giving it my full support. Thank you very much.
Minister Tom Tugendhat.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, what can I say? It's a huge honour to be here under your chairship, but it's also a huge pleasure to be speaking on a bill that I must admit, it wasn't immediately what I would have thought was my specialist subject. But it does raise... Hang on. But it does raise... a bit harsh. It does raise very important security considerations. And so it's actually been an enormous pleasure to read into this bill and to read around the impressive work that the Honourable Member for Cardiff West has done, because I think this debate has shown quite simply the passion of this House, twins with the passion of our country for what has always been known as the beautiful game. And though it doesn't always attract the affections of everybody in this chamber, and I know I disappoint some in the Tonbridge Angels when I say that, though many other sports clubs are obviously spared the pain of my support, it really does bring people together. I was often, when travelling or when serving overseas, I was often touched by the fact that a community of Brits from any part of our country can immediately find an easy conversation and a bond over various different football teams that some may support and others may vigorously and majestically oppose. And I don't know why I find myself looking at the Honourable Labour South Ribble there as a Manchester United fan. But for some reason Manchester United did seem to come up quite a lot as a divisive subject. So it certainly is... I will, of course, give way.
I'm very grateful to the Minister for giving way. I, like him, have lived and worked around the world. And whilst he's making a humorous point about that opportunity for bonding, I would say it's not just with Brits. You know, I lived and worked in Africa. The first word out of their mouths was Bobby Charlton. The second word out of their mouths was David Beckham at the time. And whilst jumpers for goalposts can often be used as a bit of a trite word, I have had conversations with people whose language I could speak not a jot, but we were united by the language of football. Does he agree that that's something that he's done, perhaps?
Funnily enough, I agree it's something I've witnessed. I've always struggled to join the conversation. I was... Recently, actually, I found myself in New York at the funeral of Henry Kissinger, and a few people there were discussing his passion for Arsenal Football Club and asked me about the latest season in London football. I have to confess I found myself slightly wanting for words, but it was an environment in which there were many others to supply them, so I was delighted to stay silent as the prowess of the various football teams were discussed. It is actually, funnily enough, that discussing Arsenal, though, today, amongst the research that I've been doing into this bill, it turns out that Cardiff City won the FA Cup in 1927 by beating Arsenal, which I have to say is a remarkable achievement. 1-0, Hughie Ferguson, I believe, was the goal scorer. There you go. It's amazing. It's amazing what you can get help with if you ask the right questions, isn't it? And that on St George's Day as well. How's that for a triple? There we go. Look, it is absolutely true that football does bind people together around the world, and the number of conversations that you can have travelling, meeting heads of state, meeting heads of government, meeting ministers and officials, and indeed just taxi drivers and folk around the world is extraordinary in the conversations you can have, because football really does unite. And that's why I think this bill is actually so important. I'm just going to start on one of the points the Honourable Member for Shipley raised. Why is this only football? Why isn't it other sports? Well, the reality is that football really is hugely dominant in terms of sporting appearances and sporting interest in the United Kingdom. And it's absolutely clear that over the last few years, over the last few decades even, the reality is that football has dominated our sporting spectator sport and the sporting appeal for spectators. And it's been so dominant that sadly that has caused problems. Now, I don't want to blame fans, that wouldn't be right, but it is when you have large crowds gathering, then you have challenges with managing those crowds. Sadly, other sports are yet to attract quite the same interest, and of course I will.
I'm very grateful to him. I understand the point he's making, but if I could just say that last year we saw at the Grand National at Aintree lots of people entering the racecourse there without a ticket, whose only purpose was to cause as much destruction and misery as possible, and led to quite a lot of disorder. And my understanding, I could be wrong, but my understanding is that nobody has been punished for that particular outrage that actually led in some respects to those animal welfare issues as well, because of the carnage that they were causing. So I would just gently say to him, I think this does apply to more than just football, and if he wants to look for another sport, I think horse racing and what happened at Aintree and the Grand National last year, and may well happen again this year, would be a good case in point for him.
Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Member for raising that, and I'll certainly look into it. I'll make sure that we have a proper scrub of other sporting events that might qualify. I think the point that I was making was that it's the vast majority of football, but he's right. There are standalone sporting events like Aintree that really do attract huge crowds as a one-off, even if I'm delighted to be in Market Rasen not very long ago, and a fantastic ground, but the reality is the crowds weren't quite the same, and indeed at Linkfield, though there is some interest, it's not quite the same pressure as he described. So I take the point that he makes, and he's absolutely right to say it. The reality is, though, that this bill has really been an extraordinary effort by the Honourable Member for Cardiff West in bringing together members from across this House to make sure that the work that has been done previous is summarised into these short words in order to keep fans safe. Now, I'm very, very grateful that he's done that, because as members have demonstrated in participating today, the words that he has chosen have reached across the House and have united people. And they've done so because when we're thinking about our own sporting events, we know that those pressures and those moments of family time that people can enjoy, can be threatened by individuals who could disrupt. And here he also raised in this bill, in fact, very carefully, the point that these are not automatic bans. These do not raise such a status as an automatic ban. Those can only be issued by courts following a conviction for a football-related offence. So that is not within the scope of this bill, but is in fact covered by other legislation should it be necessary. And I think that's rather an important aspect, because the reality is this bill is actually very constrained. The Honourable Member for Shipley's point earlier, the key to good legislation is to make sure you write it in a way that it works, not in a way that it expands. And I think this is a tight piece of legislation that does exactly what it's supposed to do. Now, it won't do some of the things that were feared, quite rightly. And the Honourable Lady for South Ribble raised the question about whether it would criminalise those who were in possession of a valid ticket, as indeed she was in her leapfrogging days. And it certainly won't do that. Those who are in possession of a valid ticket are free to enter a ground and should be able to access the ground. The fact that the turnstile doesn't work really is a test of her athletics, not of the law. And I'm delighted to say that I have absolutely no doubt that she would be vaulting it again were the same situation to arise. I was also asked, and forgive me, I can't remember which honourable member asked this question, but the question was whether or not it is an offence only committed if a person is attempting to attend a football match. it doesn't cover those trying to get into pubs or car parks unless they're actually part of the controlled zone. So it's when a football stadium has a controlled zone, and we all know that there are some that do, others that don't, and for those of you who've been to the Army-Navy rugby match, you'll know that the car park is the most important part of that controlled zone. And in fact, I have had the great privilege over many years of attending the Army and Navy rugby match. I think I've been on about half a dozen to a dozen occasions. And in that time, I'm very proud to say I have watched 15 minutes of rugby in total. The tragedy is that it is really, actually I should recognise it's actually its own security a nightmare in its own case, because of course it's the most extraordinary reunion, and many people find that the car park of Twickenham at that point becomes the most extraordinary gathering of people you haven't seen since, Iraq or Afghanistan or wherever it might be. And it's extraordinary how many formerly terrifying sergeants major or generals seem to be somewhat more friendly shortly before the kick-off. And I'm sure it has absolutely nothing to do with the generous sponsorship of Pimm's or Green King or any of the other suppliers who are extremely generous in making sure that those events go with the passion and drive that you would anticipate. But I will, of course, give way.
Grateful, but on a more serious point, because he's prompted me to have a think about this. I know I mentioned it earlier, but he mentioned about car parks, and I know it was a subject that I raised, and maybe I'm dwelling too much on it, Madam Deputy Speaker. But if somebody has a valid match ticket, but doesn't have a valid ticket for the car park, is the person creating an offence? Because it says here that the offence is only created if they try and, at the time of entry, they do not have a match ticket for the match. So it seems to me that they may have a match ticket, but they're still trying to enter a place that they're not entitled to enter. And I just wondered whether or not that was by design, perhaps, of this bill, or whether that was a problem of the bill that needs to be ironed out.
At a risk of being corrected by officials, I'm going to say clearly this is about the match ticket, not about the car park ticket. And the reason for that is because the match ticket allows access to the stadium to the event, and that's what is being criminalised. The access to the car park, so long as it isn't within the control zone, so long as it isn't an area that would otherwise be impermissible without a match ticket, is not is not covered by this bill. Because a car park ticket can usually, mostly, be bought later. And in this circumstance, we're not seeking to criminalise that. What we're seeking to do is to make sure that the Honourable Member's Bill allows those who have a valid right of access to the event to get into the event without allowing those who think that there is grounds for disruption or for tailgating or for whatever it may be to exploit a loophole in the law to get away with jumping over a wall, pushing through turnstiles, or whatever it may be. I will give way again.
Very good. He's being very generous, and the explanation he gave makes a great deal of sense. But if he wishes to come to Bradford City on any match day, as part of his research for this particular piece of legislation, he's very welcome. I will let him come with me, sir, and make sure he has a valid ticket so he doesn't fall foul of the legislation. But what he would find at Bradford City is that actually that there is limited car parking, which is often at a premium that people would very much like to take advantage of. And so it does seem that there might be an issue that lots of people tailgate in and try and barge their way into the car parking. Even though they've got a match ticket, it still would be causing quite a deal of a problem. But it seems to me they wouldn't be falling foul of this legislation because they had a match ticket.
Actually, I would be delighted to take up the Honourable Member's invitation. I have never seen football played in Bradford, and I'm sure Bradford City would offer a fantastic afternoon, and I would very much enjoy it. I will ignore the words from the Honourable Member for Cardiff West, who's been very disparaging about Bradford City. I simply can't believe that would be true, that the Honourable Member for Shipley would not be backing a winner, I mean, after his reputation. So I will stay silent on that accusation. If I may, I'm not going. This bill quite deliberately doesn't go into car parking. The reason it doesn't is because, as he'll be well aware, that in many areas car parking is very different. So some stadia have car parking available with it. Some stadia, have car parking on the street or in neighbouring car parks, which would be covered by local government ordinances and so on. So it would add complication and not clarity to the bill. And to his eternal point, Occam's razor is to get to the heart of the matter, and he would be the first critic of any bill that started to be expansive and started to look like it might be including car parks, supermarket car parks, or indeed any other kind of car park, and he would rightly be critical of it. So that's why this bill is written and drafted as tightly as it is, and why it's so clear that so many of us support it, because the bill has given us the space to focus on that part of the offence that is actually important to all of us. So if I may, I'll turn back a little bit to the bill and say that what the honourable member who has set out in this bill has very carefully drafted it is this new offence of unauthorised entry or attempted unauthorised entry to designate football matches in England and Wales. Now, in practice, designated football matches really does mean elite football matches, and for these purposes, that does include, obviously, Manchester United. The bill will also enable a court to impose a football banning order against a person convicted of this offence. Banning orders provide an effective tool to combat football-related disorder by preventing disruptive individuals from attending regulated matches for between 3 and 10 years. Now, as we've heard, and I'd like to pay my own tribute to Baroness Casey, whose extraordinary work, not just here actually, but in reforming and looking at reviewing various other aspects of our national life that have required attention. Her independent review here into the appalling disorder that occurred during the Euro 2020 final resulted in a clear recommendation that action needed to be taken to deter the practice of tailgating, which is the phenomenon that we've been covering of a ticketless person following a legitimate entrant into the stadium. But of course, this bill is drafted because tailgating is not the only problematic behaviour that we see. And in the context of attempted entry to football matches, there are many other routes. Indeed, jumping over walls, which we've seen in some stadia, or hanging down from buildings and jumping through windows, which we've seen occasionally abroad on videos, is extremely concerning as well. Not least, it can lead to enormous personal harm and it can encourage people to take extremely unwise risks. But it can then lead to a crush within the building that could lead to harm, not just to fans, but also to those working in the stadium. And as we know, stadia these days are major businesses, many of them employing many people on match days. Now, estimates suggest that somewhere in the region of 3,000 to 5,000 England fans without tickets gained entry to the Euro 2020 final, largely through mass forced entry. And witnesses on the day speak of being terrified by the reckless and aggressive behaviour of fans. I must say, despite my own lack of passion in this regard, I have taken my children to football matches and have enjoyed the days with them. And must admit, my children seem to be rather more impressed with the games than I've ever been, but have enjoyed it very much. And having the opportunity to see it through their eyes has been a great blessing, actually. I found it enormously warming. Thank you very much. What would be concerning, however, and why I think this bill is so important, is for football to be closed off to families, for people to feel that they were threatened or wished to keep their kids away from such events, when exactly, as the Honourable Lady for South Ribble correctly points out, as they used to be. I remember when I was a child, I suspect one of the reasons why we weren't encouraged to attend, despite an uncle of mine's great passion for Tottenham Hotspur. In fact, happy birthday to my uncle, the Spurs fan, whose birthday it is today. It is, he's in the other place, actually, so maybe if we shout loud enough, he'll hear it. The reality was that at that point, in our national life, very sadly, football was disrupted by significant areas of violence, and indeed in some areas appeared to be almost lawless. And I'm very grateful not only to the Football Association but to police forces around the United Kingdom and to various different organisations that have contributed to making football safe, so that even at the Tonbridge Angels, not traditionally a hotbed for any dissent, the family welcome is remarkable and extremely important. But look, more broadly, other methods, unauthorised methods of entry, may also occur at football matches and range from surreptitious entry, including, as the Honourable Member for Cardiff West suggested, bribing club staff, to various forms of deception. And I'm therefore very pleased that this bill seeks to make all forms of unauthorised entry or attempted entry an offence. Now, this is eminently sensible. Given that all attempts at unauthorised entry draw upon stadia security resources and can result in individuals with dangerous, disruptive intent gaining access to the stadium and spectators, not to mention the health and safety risks and implications that result in overcrowding, this is an important change in the law. And it's also right that it includes, quite rightly, not just the entrance points, but the outer security, the outer perimeter security, as the Honourable Member for Cardiff West set out very clearly. This is about making sure that we don't see concertina effects where pressure on one area can have repercussions in others. And he's absolutely correct that this bill sets out carefully why that is so. Now, we cannot tolerate a situation where decent, law-abiding football fans are left frightened or distressed, and neither would it be acceptable for football stadia to become unsafe because of a selfish minority. This government is clear that the safety of those attending sporting events is of the highest importance, and it is imperative that football fans are able to enjoy the sport safely in the knowledge that those who attempt to cause disorder will be swiftly dealt with. The bill will help achieve that, and that is why we are supporting it. Now, it is right and proper that those who engage in unacceptable criminal behaviour face the full force of the law, while the introduction of a new football-specific offence will also send a clear deterrent message to would-be perpetrators. As I have mentioned, the measure also enables courts to later impose a football banning order against offenders, and I would like to remind the House that football banning orders have historically proved successful in preventing known troublemakers from continuing to offend and deterring others from offending. Now, as such, the government wholeheartedly supports their use in the context of unauthorised entry to matches, and I will happily give way.
Thank you, Minister, for giving way. Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. He's speaking with great passion on the subject, and I know it's close to his heart. I mean, who amongst us hasn't enjoyed a matinee performance by England Rovers at the Oval? But could I press him on a technical detail that was raised by the Shadow Minister, and I really must press him on this before he winds up. Could he tell us who the left-back is for Tonbridge Angels?
May I just say that discretion at a moment like this is important, because, as he'll be aware, Tonbridge Angels have recently started buying a few new players, and it would be far too early for me to start picking the team. That is, after all, the manager's job, and he would not thank a Minister of the Crown stepping on his, quite right, hallowed turf. Thank you. Now, as such, it may also be helpful for members to be aware that both the police and the Football Association are similarly supportive of this bill and have contributed very helpfully. Now, I would like, again, once more, to thank the Honourable Member for Cardiff West for bringing forward this legislation. I'd also like to thank the Honourable Member for Nottingham North and the opposition for their approach to this. And I'd also like to say that this, I hope, will be an example piece of legislation that would be adopted in other assemblies. And it would certainly seem appropriate, given the importance of football in the national life of Scotland and Northern Ireland. And so I would like to thank very much those who have contributed to this debate today. This is an important measure which will ensure the perpetrators of these disruptive and dangerous offences face justice and it should provide a strong deterrent effect. I therefore join with the Honourable Member for Cardiff West and urge the whole House to get behind it too.
With the leave of the House, Kevin Brennan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. With the leave of the House, can I just rise to sum up briefly at the end of the debate and thank all the honourable members who've contributed and make interventions during the course of the debate. And I feel it's been an extremely useful airing of some of the issues around the bill, including the speech and interventions from the honourable member for Shipley, who I think raised some very valid points, some of which have been addressed during the course of the debate subsequently in interventions from me and from both front benches. But his points are very valid, and I'm sure we will delve further into them when hopefully the bill makes its progress into the committee stage. But can I thank all the other honourable members who've contributed as well to the debate, the Honourable Lady for South Ribble, who obviously is very knowledgeable on the subject of supporting football, even when it's painful, and also the interventions that I had from my friend from Newport East, and my honourable friend who's sitting on the Whip's front bench now, having moved from the back benches during the course of the debate. I think we've had a very good airing of the bill. I thank everyone. In particular, can I thank the Minister and the Shadow Minister. The Minister mentioned the Football Association. Of course, that covers England. The Football Association of Wales have also been very supportive of the bill. The Select Committee, all of whom have supported my bill and featured it in their report. Civil servants, the clerks, you, Madam Deputy Speaker, Mr Speaker, who was here earlier on, and the Deputy Speaker, and everyone else in the room, including whips on both sides of the House, who've been extremely helpful, and also Mary in the members' tea room for her support of the bill as well.
That was a fitting end to that speech. We're always thankful to Mary in the members' tea room. and to everyone else who looks after us in the members' tea room, especially on a Friday. The question is that the bill be now read a second time. As many as that opinion is, say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. And so we come to the fourth bill to be